There is a grave that was never found. A body that was never confirmed. A name that traveled from the sagas of medieval Iceland into modern television screens, carrying with it an image so specific it feels like memory rather than legend. A warrior with iron in his name, sailing south toward the Mediterranean, founding a dynasty that would one day call itself the Kings of Sweden. Bjorn Ironside. For centuries, his story was treated the way sagas are always treated by people who want them to be true, as history slightly exaggerated, rather than legends slightly grounded. A son of Ragnar. A raider of the Mediterranean coast. A founding father of Swedish kingship. The story had shape, direction, and above all, certainty. But certainty is exactly what modern genetics has been quietly dismantling, grave by grave, genome by genome, across the very regions Bjorn Ironside is said to have come from. This is not a story about proving a legend true. It is a story about what happens when a population once assumed to be simple, singular and self-contained turns out to be something else entirely. Layered, mixed, and far stranger than the sagas ever needed it to be. For most of the last 1,000 years, the accepted picture of Bjorn Ironside sat inside a larger, tidier narrative about the Viking Age itself. Norse sagas, composed centuries after the events they claim to describe, told of a Scandinavian world expanding outward from a stable, ancestral homeland, closely related clans, a shared bloodline, a fierce and coherent people spreading through raiding and settlement rather than blending and absorption. Bjorn fit neatly into that frame. According to the sagas, he was one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, said to have led raids deep into the Mediterranean, sacking towns along the coasts of what is now France, Spain, and possibly even Italy, before returning north to claim territory in Sweden and, according to later medieval genealogies, founding the Munso dynasty, a line of kings whose descendants were said to rule parts of Sweden for generations. Historians treated this with reasonable caution even before genetics entered the picture. The sagas were oral tradition first, written down centuries later by Christian scribes working from stories already reshaped by generations of retelling. Some historians suspected Bjorn Ironside might be a real historical figure, distorted by legend. Others suspected he was a composite, several Swedish or Danish raiders folded into a single memorable name, the way oral cultures often compress complicated history into simple, unforgettable characters. Either way, the underlying assumption remained largely intact. Whoever Bjorn Ironside really was, he emerged from a relatively coherent Scandinavian population, a bloodline distinct and self-contained, waiting only for ships and ambition to carry it outward into the wider world. That was the stable story. And like most stable stories about the deep past, it was stable mainly because no one had yet found a way to test it properly. The first cracks did not come from Bjorn's legend directly. They came from the ground beneath Sweden itself. Archaeologists excavating Viking Age sites across Scandinavia, Birka, Sigtuna, Gotland, and dozens of smaller burial grounds, kept encountering a pattern that did not sit comfortably with the idea of a closed, homogeneous Norse population. Grave goods sometimes told one story. Skeletal and later genetic evidence told another. At Birka, one of the most important Viking Age trading centers in Sweden, archaeologists had long celebrated a particular grave as a striking example of elite Viking warrior burial. Full weaponry, strategic gaming pieces suggesting knowledge of military tactics, a horse, the complete visual language of a high-status warrior. For over a century, the assumption stood unquestioned. This was a great Viking warrior, and given the equipment, almost certainly a man. That assumption did not survive contact with the genome. When researchers finally applied ancient DNA analysis to the Birka warrior grave, the results did not simply refine the picture. They inverted it. The individual buried with the full weight of high-status warrior equipment was, biologically, female. This did not fit the old story. It was not even in the range of outcomes the old story allowed for. And this is where the science had to step forward carefully, without either overstating or dismissing what it had found. Genetics, in this case, operated primarily through two tools working together: osteological analysis of the skeleton itself, and ancient DNA sequencing capable of confirming biological sex and broader ancestry with a level of certainty archaeology alone could never reach. Where sagas relied on interpretation and grave goods relied on inference, the genome offered something closer to hard evidence, imperfect, incomplete, but far less negotiable than assumption. The Birka finding did not claim to rewrite the entire Viking Age on its own. Researchers were careful to note that a single grave, however significant, cannot generalize into a universal rule about gender roles across the whole of Viking society. But it accomplished something just as important. It proved that the confident, closed narrative historians had been telling about Viking identity, who could be a warrior, who could be buried like one, who the story even allowed to exist, was less certain than the confidence of previous generations suggested. That was the first fracture. It was not about Bjorn Ironside directly. But it opened the door to a far larger question that would eventually reach into the very population his legend claimed to come from. If a single grave could dismantle a century of assumptions, what would happen when researchers stopped looking at individual burials and started looking at the deep genetic architecture of the entire Viking world? This is where the science shifted from isolated discovery to systematic investigation, and where the story of Bjorn Ironside's homeland began to look considerably less simple than the sagas ever allowed. In the early 2020s, an international team of researchers completed one of the largest ancient DNA studies ever conducted on the Viking Age, sequencing the genomes of more than 400 individuals recovered from burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Baltic region, and beyond. The method relied on whole genome sequencing, capable of reading not fragments but broad architecture, comparing ancestry components across geography and centuries in a way no archaeological survey ever could. The scale mattered enormously. Earlier, smaller studies could suggest patterns. A dataset this large could test them. And the first major finding cut directly against the old assumption of a closed, homogeneous Scandinavian population. Even before the Viking Age formally began, Scandinavia itself was already shaped by centuries of contact and gene flow with populations from the British Isles, the Baltic coast, and continental Europe. The idea of an isolated Norse homeland, waiting undisturbed until longships carried its bloodline outward, did not match the genetic record. The blending had already begun long before anyone called it the Viking Age. That was not a contradiction of Bjorn Ironside's story. It was something more unsettling for the old narrative. It suggested the population he supposedly came from had never been the pure, singular bloodline the sagas needed in order to make sense. Sweden specifically, the region most closely tied to Bjorn Ironside's legendary founding of the Munso dynasty, showed its own distinct signature within this broader picture, one that researchers found particularly striking. Where Viking Age burial sites in Denmark showed stronger genetic signals of contact with populations from the British Isles, consistent with a well-documented Danish raiding and settlement across England, burial sites in eastern Sweden showed a different pattern entirely, stronger genetic signals connecting Swedish Viking Age populations eastward, toward the Baltic coast and further into regions associated with what medieval sources called the Rus, trade and raiding networks stretching along the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, down toward the Byzantine world. This detail carries real weight, because it lines up with something the sagas themselves preserved, even if historians could never previously confirm it at the genetic level. Swedish Vikings were consistently associated, in medieval sources, with eastward expansion rather than westward raiding, trading networks along the Volga and Dnieper river systems, contact with Slavic populations, and eventual involvement in the founding of early Rus principalities. If Bjorn Ironside's dynasty truly took root in this specific Swedish context, the population surrounding it was not simply Norse in isolation. It was Norse increasingly entangled with Baltic and Slavic contact, generation after generation, long before any king's name was carved into a runestone. The story did not collapse under this evidence. It widened. If you find it fascinating how much of this history was sitting quietly in bone and blood, waiting for the right tools to read it, consider subscribing, because very little about the ancient past turns out to be as simple as the first story we were told. The deeper researchers pushed into the genetic architecture of Viking Age Sweden, the more the old, closed narrative continued to give way. Certain elite burial sites, the kind traditionally associated with high-status Norse lineages, precisely the social stratum the Munso dynasty and figures like Bjorn Ironside would have belonged to, revealed ancestry components that did not trace cleanly to a single Scandinavian source at all. Some individuals carried detectable genetic contributions associated with populations from further east and south than sagas ever explicitly acknowledged, likely the result of generations of trade alliances, marriage arrangements between elite families, and the movement of captives and settlers along Viking trade networks that stretched, at their furthest reach, toward Constantinople itself. This did not mean Bjorn Ironside, if he existed as described, was somehow not really Swedish, or not really Norse. Ancestry rarely resolves into such simple categories once you actually look closely enough. What it meant was that the very concept of a pure, singular Swedish Viking bloodline, the kind the medieval genealogies implicitly relied upon when tracing kings back to legendary founders, did not match the genetic reality of the population those kings supposedly emerged from. Researchers proposed several frameworks to explain this layered pattern, and it is worth holding each one carefully rather than collapsing them into a single dramatic headline. The first framework involves long-term regional admixture, centuries of contact between early Scandinavian populations and neighboring groups around the Baltic Sea, driven by trade routes that existed long before the Viking Age is traditionally said to begin. Under this view, the diversity found in Swedish Viking genomes was not an anomaly. It was the accumulated residue of a trading world that had never been as closed as later legend implied. The second framework involves elite exogamy, the practice, common among many early medieval aristocracies, of arranging marriages across distant, often foreign elite families specifically to build alliances, secure trade routes, or cement political power. If the founders of dynasties like the Munso line drew brides and allies from Baltic, Slavic, or even further flung elite families, their descendants would carry a genetically layered inheritance almost by design, regardless of how thoroughly later sagas erased that complexity in favor of a cleaner, more heroic bloodline. Story. The third framework, treated with particular caution by researchers, involves cultural continuity without full genetic continuity, the possibility that the title, dynasty, or legendary founding figure persisted as a political and cultural institution even as the actual genetic lineage shifted, blended, or was partially replaced across generations. Kingship, in other words, may have been a story a dynasty told about itself, sustained through ritual and record rather than an unbroken, verifiable bloodline. None of these frameworks fully displaces the others. The evidence suggests all three were likely operating simultaneously, in different measures, across different generations of the very population Bjorn Ironside's legend claims to descend from. There is a further layer of complexity researchers had to reckon with, one that rarely makes it into popular retellings of Viking history: the difference between what maternal and paternal lines of inheritance actually preserve. Mitochondrial DNA, passed almost unchanged from mother to child, tells a different story than the Y chromosome, passed from father to son. In several Viking Age burial sites, researchers found a striking asymmetry between the two, paternal lineages showing tighter clustering around core Scandinavian signatures, while maternal lineages showed considerably more diversity, including signals associated with populations from the British Isles and the Baltic. This asymmetry is not simply a technical footnote. It suggests a pattern of contact that shaped families in a specific, gendered way, Norse men, in many cases, forming unions with women from outside the immediate Scandinavian homeland, whether through trade alliances, raiding, captivity, or settlement abroad, more often than the reverse. If a founding dynasty like the Munso line emerged from this broader social pattern, its purity, in the narrow sense the sagas implied, would have been undermined from the maternal side long before any later admixture entered the picture at all. Historians cannot say this applied to any specific family with certainty. But as a population-level pattern, it complicates the clean genealogical charts later medieval scribes were so eager to produce. What elevated this research from suggestive to genuinely landmark was, once again, the scale and rigor behind it. Comparing hundreds of Viking Age genomes against both earlier Scandinavian populations and broader European and Western Asian reference panels allowed researchers to distinguish between coincidence and pattern in a way smaller, isolated studies never could. It allowed them to say with real statistical confidence that the genetic diversity found across Viking Age Scandinavia, and Sweden specifically, was not noise. It was signal. And that signal produced a twist that even some researchers had not fully anticipated going into the study. It was not simply that Swedish Viking Age populations showed foreign admixture. Some degree of contact was already expected, given well-documented trade routes. The twist was in the direction and persistence of certain ancestry components, genetic signals tracing not just to nearby Baltic populations, but threading further, into regions associated with early Slavic populations and in some individuals, tentative signals connecting toward populations further east and south along the old trade corridors leading to the Byzantine world. Not simply contact at the edges of Scandinavian society. Contact embedded within it, generation after generation, in exactly the elite social layer that produced kings, warlords, and, if he existed in any historically grounded form, figures remembered later as Bjorn Ironside. The genome was not erasing the story of a Swedish founding dynasty. It was revealing an older, more entangled story sitting quietly underneath it, one the sagas had no interest in preserving because it complicated the clean, heroic bloodline they needed their kings to have. This matters far beyond one legendary warrior or one royal dynasty. It reframes how we should think about identity and inheritance across the entire ancient and medieval world. Human populations have never moved or bred or ruled in straight, uncomplicated lines. Every population historians have ever studied closely enough turns out to be a confluence rather than a single stream, shaped by trade, conquest, marriage, captivity, and the simple human habit of moving toward opportunity wherever it appeared, whether that opportunity was a fertile river valley, a wealthy trading post, or a strategic marriage alliance. Viking Age Sweden was not an exception to that pattern. It was, the genome suggests, a particularly vivid example of it. The old maps assumed bloodline equaled nation equaled identity, in a clean, closed loop. The evidence beneath Scandinavia's soil no longer allows that assumption to stand unchallenged. Picture, for a moment, the world Bjorn Ironside's dynasty is said to have ruled. Not a single fortress bloodline standing apart from history, but the shorelines of Lake Mälaren in central Sweden, where Birka once thrived as one of the busiest trading hubs in northern Europe, ships arriving not only from Norway and Denmark, but from the Baltic coast, from Slavic river settlements, from merchants carrying silver minted in cities the saga's original audience would never have visited themselves. Picture the long trade route east, following rivers deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine, toward trading posts where Norse, Slavic and Byzantine goods and, quietly, jeans, changed hands alongside furs, silver and amber. This was not an isolated homeland waiting to be discovered by outsiders. It was already a crossroads, centuries before any king's genealogy was written down to make the bloodline sound clean. That is the world a figure like Bjorn Ironside, real or partly legendary, would have actually emerged from, not a fortress of Nordic purity, but a threshold, a meeting point, a place where ancient and arriving constantly, quietly merged. Now travel further east in your imagination, along the river systems the Swedish Vikings knew intimately, narrow waterways widening into trade posts, portage routes where ships were dragged overland between river systems, markets where Norse silver changed hands for goods carried up from Byzantium. Somewhere along those rivers, generation after generation, Norse families settled among Slavic populations, married into them, raised children who carried both worlds inside a single genome. Centuries later, those same river routes would help give rise to the early Rus principalities, a political and cultural legacy remembered today far more for its Slavic character than its Scandinavian origins, even though the genetic and historical threads connecting the two remain, to this day, difficult to fully separate. If this kind of layered, evidence-driven history interests you, let me know in the comments which figure or population from the ancient world deserves the next investigation, because almost every legendary bloodline, once examined closely enough, turns out to be more complicated and more interesting than the story first told about it. So where does this leave Bjorn Ironside himself? Here, scientific honesty has to hold firm against the pull of a satisfying ending. No confirmed remains of Bjorn Ironside exist. No skeleton has been sequenced and verified as belonging to him specifically. Historians remain genuinely divided on whether he was a real historical raider and dynasty founder whose story was later embellished, a composite figure built from several real Swedish or Danish leaders, or largely a literary and genealogical invention designed to give a later royal dynasty a suitably heroic founding myth. Claiming to have found Bjorn's DNA directly would not be responsible science. It would be theater borrowing science's credibility without earning it. But the absence of Bjorn's own genome does not mean the science has nothing meaningful to say about him. It means the meaningful answer sits one level up, not in a single skeleton, but in the population his legend claims to represent. And that population, according to the best available evidence, was never the closed, singular Nordic bloodline the sagas needed in order to tell a clean story about kings descending from legendary warriors. It was a Baltic crossroads population, shaped by centuries of trade, marriage, and movement stretching from the fjords of Scandinavia to the river routes of the early Rus and beyond. If Bjorn Ironside existed in any historically grounded form, he was not the product of an isolated warrior bloodline standing apart from the world. He was, almost certainly, a living expression of exactly the kind of layered ancestry the genome has now confirmed defined Viking-age Sweden far more than any saga ever admitted. That reframing does not shrink the legend. It enlarges it. For centuries, we told this story as though bloodlines were fortresses, defensible and pure, passed cleanly from father to son across generations until they reached a name worth putting in a saga. The genome tells us something closer to the deeper truth of nearly every population that has ever existed. Identity is built as much as it is inherited. Ancestry accumulates in layers, not clean lines. The deeper you dig into any founding legend, the wider and more entangled the real story tends to become. Bjorn Ironside may never be found in a laboratory. No sequencer will ever confirm whether he truly sailed into the Mediterranean, whether he truly founded a dynasty of Swedish kings, or whether his name was simply the most memorable thread stitched together from several real men's lives. But the population he supposedly rose from has left its own signature, scattered across burial sites from Burka to the Baltic coast. A signature that refuses the simple, singular story once told about it. The map handed down through the sagas was too small from the very beginning. The genome does not just fill in its missing sections. It redraws the borders entirely, revealing that even the most legendary bloodlines of the Viking Age were never as pure, as closed, or as simple as the story required them to be. They were something older, more connected, and far more human than any legend ever dared to admit.